Good morning and greetings to our unseen friends. Now, before we speak of prayer, before we speak of God, before we speak of anything at all, let us recognize something very important. The deepest prayer that will ever be prayed in your life is not spoken. It is not thought. It is not even formed. It is received. Most of you have come here because you are seeking something. You may not even know what it is you are seeking. You may call it peace. You may call it healing. You may call it guidance. You may call it relief. But underneath all of those words, there is only one longing: to rest in God without fear. And so I ask you now, not as a technique, not as an instruction, but as a gentle invitation. Let us be still for a moment, not to accomplish something, not to get somewhere, but simply to acknowledge that God already is. Be still and know that I am God. That is not a command to the body. It is not a command to the mind. It is a revelation of a law. When stillness is present, God is known, not believed in, not reasoned about, known. You see, we have made prayer into an activity. We have made it into effort. We have made it into words and requests and affirmations and pleading. But the scripture does not say, speak and know that I am God. It does not say, ask and know that I am God. It says, be still. Now, I want you to notice something very subtle. The verse does not say, be still so that God may come. It says, be still and know God is already present. It is our motion, our mental motion, our emotional motion, our fearful motion that keeps us from knowing it. So if nothing seems to be happening right now, that is not a failure. That is the doorway. If your mind feels empty, that is not absence. That is preparation. If you feel nothing at all, that is not lack. That is the beginning of grace. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Not do, not fix, not plan. Stand still. Now, many of you have been taught that silence is dangerous, that if you are not thinking, something will go wrong, that if you are not asking God for help, God will not help, that if you are not reminding God of your needs, they will be forgotten. But listen to the Master's words. Your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask him. If God knows before you ask, then asking cannot be the essence of prayer. Asking may be a stage along the way, but it is not the goal. The goal is awareness, communion, union. The psalmist says, in quietness and confidence shall be your strength, not in striving, not in repeating, not in effort, quietness. And so we begin here, not with teaching, but with recognition, not with instruction, but with surrender. We begin by laying down every concept of prayer we have ever been taught, and we say quietly within ourselves, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Notice that it does not say, speak, Lord, for thy servant is talking. It says, heareth. This moment, this very moment, is already prayer if you do not interfere with it. This breath is already prayer if you do not try to improve it. This stillness is already God contact if you do not attempt to name it. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee. Stayed, not busy with thee, not working for thee. Stayed. So we rest here for a moment, not waiting for a message, not waiting for a sign, not waiting for a feeling. We rest because God is. And because God is, nothing needs to be added to this moment for it to be holy. If you feel unworthy, let that go. If you feel distracted, let that be. If you feel expectant, release even that. There is nothing you must bring to God because God is already giving itself to you. There is nothing you must say to God, because God is already speaking beneath thought, beneath emotion, beneath effort. In thy silence I shall come to you. That is the promise. Not in your words, not in your asking, in your silence. So we begin this work not as seekers trying to reach God, but as witnesses allowing God to be revealed. And if all you can do right now is sit quietly and listen without knowing what you are listening for, then you are praying more deeply than you ever have before. That is enough for now. That is more than enough. Now we come to something that may trouble some of you at first. And if it does, be grateful for that trouble, because disturbance of the old thought is the first sign that truth is pressing at the door of consciousness. For generations, prayer has been taught as asking God to heal, asking God to provide, asking God to protect, asking God to change conditions. And this has been done with sincerity, with devotion, and often with great faith, as faith has been humanly understood. But sincerity alone does not make a thing true, and repetition does not make it real. Let us look carefully, very quietly, at what asking really implies. When you ask God for something, you are confessing that something is absent. When you ask God to heal, you are affirming disease. When you ask God to provide, you are acknowledging lack. When you ask God to bring peace, you are declaring conflict. And so, while the lips may be calling God, the consciousness is bearing witness to something other than God. Now, do not misunderstand me. There is no condemnation here. We have all prayed this way. I prayed this way. I pleaded this way. I begged this way. And yet, there came a moment, one that changed everything, when the inner voice said, "Why are you telling me what I already know?" Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. If that is true, and Scripture assures us it is, then what place does pleading have? What place does persuasion have? What place does repetition have? You see, asking belongs to the stage of belief. It does not belong to the stage of realization. And belief, however sincere, still carries within it the seed of doubt. For if you truly knew that God is present, that God is the substance of your being, that God is the law of harmony itself, what would you be asking for? Jesus never asked God to heal anyone. Never once. He did not stand before Lazarus and say, "Father, please change this situation." He said, "Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I knew that thou hearest me always." That is not asking. That is recognition. And so we must come to see that prayer, as taught by the Master, was not an attempt to move God. It was a yielding to God's presence. It was not effort. It was awareness. Now, here is where the human mind resists. It says, "But if I don't ask, how will God know?" And the answer is God knows, because God is. God does not learn your need. God is your need fulfilled before the need ever appears. My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Notice that the work is already underway. We are not starting something when we pray. We are acknowledging something that eternally is. The tragedy, and I use that word deliberately, is that people have been taught to measure prayer by results. They look at the body. They look at the bank account. They look at the relationship. And then they say, "My prayer worked," or "My prayer failed." But prayer does not work on effects. Prayer reveals cause, and cause is God. As long as you are asking God to change effects, you are working backwards. You are treating the shadow instead of the substance. You are trying to rearrange appearances instead of resting in the law that produces harmony. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Notice again, Seek first, not seek things. Seek the kingdom. And the kingdom is not a place. It is a state of consciousness in which God is known as present. Now let us be very clear. This does not mean we ignore human need. It means we do not worship it. It means we do not give it power. It means we do not kneel before appearances and call that prayer. True prayer does not say, God, come into this situation. True prayer says, God is here, and I will not react to the appearance. And that is why I have said, and I will say it again until it is understood, that the measure of your prayer is your non-reaction. If you can pray and then stop watching the clock, stop checking the body, stop measuring progress, stop fearing outcomes, then you have prayed. But if you pray and then immediately turn back to the appearance to see whether God has obeyed you, then you have not prayed at all. You have merely hoped. Stand ye still and see the salvation of the Lord. Salvation is not something God does in response to your request. Salvation is revealed when you stop interfering. So prayer, as we are coming to understand it now, is not a conversation in which you speak and God listens. It is a surrender in which you listen and God speaks, not in words, not in thoughts, but in assurance, in peace, in that deep inner knowing that does not argue and does not explain. When you reach that point, you will discover something very beautiful. You no longer have the desire to ask. The need to ask dissolves, and in its place comes trust, not trust that something will happen, but trust that what is happening is already God in expression. That is why the Master could sleep in the boat while the storm raged. He was not praying for the storm to stop. He was resting in the Father. And when consciousness is at rest, storms have no audience. So we are not learning how to pray better. We are unlearning how to pray wrongly. We are letting go of prayer as effort and discovering prayer as communion. And now, having seen this, the question naturally arises. If we are not to ask, if we are not to affirm, if we are not to plead, what are we to do? That brings us to the heart of this work. Now, at this point, many sincere students say, all right, if I am not to ask God, then I must at least think rightly. I must hold the truth in consciousness. I must affirm what is true until the false disappears. And so begins what is commonly called mental work. This, too, is a stage. And like all stages, it is not wrong, but it is not final. It is a doorway, not the house. Mental work is an attempt to use truth. And the moment you attempt to use truth, you have already stepped out of truth. For truth is not a tool. Truth is, God is not something to be wielded by the mind. God is that which swallows up the mind in stillness. Now let us look carefully at affirmations. An affirmation is a statement made by the human mind in an effort to convince itself or God of something it does not yet realize. If realization were present, affirmation would be unnecessary. You do not affirm that the sun is shining when you are standing in its light. You do not declare that you are alive in order to breathe. You breathe because life is already present. And yet, how often we hear, I must hold the truth, or I must declare the truth, or I must argue the truth against appearances. But let me ask you quietly, who is doing this? Holding. Who is doing this? Declaring. Who is doing this? Arguing. It is the human mind. And the human mind, however educated, however sincere, however disciplined, has never known God. Be still and know that I am God. Notice again, knowing does not come from thinking. Knowing comes when thinking ceases. Now, there was a time, yes, a long time when I believed that if I could just know enough truth, if I could just memorize enough passages, if I could just reason correctly enough, then healing would follow. And sometimes it did, but sometimes it did not. And it was those times that did not respond that taught me the most, because eventually the inner voice said, "Why are you trying to do my work?" And in that moment, I saw that mental work is still effort. And effort, however spiritual it may seem, is still a confession that God is not already doing the work. Jesus never treated error with argument. He never debated disease. He never reasoned with lack. He never affirmed truth over a situation. He simply rested in what he knew. And what he knew was not a statement, it was a presence. I can of mine own self do nothing. That is not humility. That is revelation. The moment you are affirming, you are doing something. And the moment you are doing something, you are standing between God and its own expression. For God does not need assistance. God does not need reinforcement. God does not need repetition. Now, do not misunderstand this. There is a place where truth statements serve a purpose. They lift consciousness. They turn the thought away from fear. They help dissolve superstition. They help break the belief that evil is power. And for this reason, they have their value. But if you stay there, if you make a home in mental work, you will eventually find yourself exhausted. You will find that you are constantly watching the body, constantly checking conditions, constantly measuring progress. And that is not faith. That is vigilance born of fear. True prayer does not watch results. True prayer rests. The mind says, I must hold this truth until the healing comes. But spirit says, let go, and the truth will hold you. There is a vast difference between thinking about God and being aware of God. Thinking is movement. Awareness is rest. Thinking tries to bring God into a situation. Awareness recognizes that God is the situation. And so we come to see that mental work is not wrong, it is incomplete. It is the second step, not the last. It prepares consciousness, but it does not consummate it. This kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. And fasting here does not mean abstaining from food. It means abstaining from thought, abstaining from effort, abstaining from trying to make something happen. The greatest fast you will ever undertake is fasting from the need to know, to do, to fix, to change. When you have reasoned as far as reason can go, when you have affirmed as far as affirmations can take you, when you have done all the mental work you know how to do, and then you stop, something very different takes place. Silence descends. Not forced silence, not practiced silence, but the silence that comes when effort collapses under its own weight. And in that silence, God speaks, not in words, not in thoughts, but in certainty. That certainty does not argue. It does not convince. It does not reassure. It simply is. And when it comes, you will know it, because fear will not be able to stand in its presence. So we are being led very gently away from doing and into being, away from effort and into receptivity, away from mental prayer and into spiritual communion. And now we are ready to go one step further. For if asking is not prayer and mental work is not prayer, then what remains? What remains is silence, not as emptiness, but as fullness, not as absence, but as presence. Now we arrive at the point where words begin to fail us, not because the subject is vague, but because it is too sacred to be contained by language. And yet, we must speak of it, if only to lead thought to the edge where thought itself must yield. Silence is not the absence of prayer. Silence is the fulfillment of prayer. Most people believe silence means nothing is happening. But that belief comes from judging spiritual activity by human sensation. In the realm of spirit, the deepest activity is invisible, inaudible, and unannounced. God does not arrive with sound. God does not move with motion. God reveals itself in stillness. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Notice that Scripture does not say, let all the earth speak rightly, or let all the earth think spiritually. It says, keep silence. Why? Because silence is the one condition in which God can be known without distortion. Now, I want you to understand something very clearly. Silence is not something you do. Silence is something that happens when you stop doing. It is not a technique you practice. It is the natural state of consciousness when effort has been relinquished. As long as you are thinking about God, you are not yet aware of God. As long as you are forming words, even sacred words, you are still standing outside the sanctuary. Words belong to the outer court. Silence belongs to the Holy of Holies. When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. That closet is not a physical place. It is the inner chamber of consciousness where thought ceases to interfere. And the door you shut is not made of wood. It is the door of mental activity. You see, the human mind wants to participate. It wants to help. It wants to cooperate. But the greatest cooperation you can offer God is non-interference. God does not need your help. God needs your availability. Now, when you first enter silence, the mind protests. It says, you are wasting time. You are doing nothing. This is unproductive. And yet, in that very nothingness, something eternal is unfolding. The silence may feel empty at first. That is because the mind has been accustomed to noise. But emptiness is not absence, it is space. And space is required for revelation. Elijah heard not the Lord in the wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in the still small voice. That still small voice is not a sound. It is a knowing. It is not something you hear with the ears. It is something you recognize with the soul. And here is the great mystery. When you enter silence, without expectation, without demand, without desire, even for God, you have already entered prayer. Not prayer as asking, but prayer as communion. In that silence, you are no longer trying to reach God. You are allowing God to reach you. And the moment you allow that, the burden of prayer falls away. The struggle ceases. The strain dissolves. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. Silence is the acknowledgement that Spirit does the work. Silence is the confession that you do not know, and that is the beginning of wisdom. Now, some of you will say, but I go into silence and nothing happens. And I tell you this, something is always happening in silence, but it does not always register in the conscious mind. Growth does not announce itself. Transformation does not report progress. The seed does not break the ground the moment it is planted. And yet, life is already active within it. So do not measure silence by sensation. Do not judge it by feeling. Do not abandon it because it seems uneventful. Silence is God's workshop, and God does not ask for your supervision. In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength, not in insight, not in understanding, quietness. This is why I have said, and I will continue to say, that prayer and fasting is the highest form of prayer. Prayer that asks nothing, fasting from thought, fasting from desire, fasting from the need to know. When you are willing to sit in silence and let God be God, something extraordinary takes place. Fear loses its audience. Doubt loses its voice. The mind loses its throne. And in that inner stillness, a presence is felt, not always dramatically, not always emotionally, but unmistakably. You may not be able to describe it, you may not be able to explain it, but you will know beyond argument that God is here. And when that knowing comes, prayer is finished, not because it has failed, but because it has been fulfilled. Now, there comes a moment on this path, a very definite moment, when the old concept of God begins to dissolve. And I must tell you honestly, this is not always a comfortable experience. In fact, for many, it is the most unsettling stage of all. You see, we do not merely let go of wrong ideas easily. We cling to them, even when they no longer serve us, because they are familiar. They have given us a sense of safety. And so when the inner teaching says, do not ask God for anything, there is often an inward cry, then what is left? What will become of me? I have heard it many times. You have taken my God away. Yes, I have taken away the God who could be used. I have taken away the God who could be persuaded, begged, reminded, or managed. I have taken away the God who lived at a distance and responded to effort, but I have not taken God away. I have only taken away the idol. The God that collapses at this stage is the God of human imagination, the God who rewards good behavior and punishes bad, the God who intervenes selectively, the God who waits to be asked. That God must disappear, because that God was never real. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And this includes the God of our own thinking. Now, when that collapse begins, the student often enters a period of confusion. Prayer no longer works the way it used to. Words feel empty. Affirmations feel hollow. Even scripture, once comforting, may feel strangely silent. And the temptation is to say, I have lost my faith. But what has really happened is that belief is giving way to realization. Remember Saul of Tarsus. He had a revelation so great that it overturned everything he had been taught. And what happened next? He did not go out preaching the next day. He disappeared into Arabia for years. Why? Because the old structure of consciousness had to be dismantled before the new could be lived. When God reveals itself, it does not simply add a new idea to your old framework. It destroys the framework. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. The dying is not physical. It is the dying of concepts, the dying of images, the dying of a God that could be understood. And this is where many turn back. They return to asking, to affirming, to effort, because effort feels safer than surrender. Effort gives the illusion of control. Silence removes it. But if you can stay with this shock, if you can remain still while the old supports fall away, you will discover something astonishing. You will discover that God does not vanish when your concepts vanish. God becomes nearer than breath. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The shadow is not death. The shadow is the loss of former light. But even there, especially there, God is present. Now, let me say this very clearly. This stage does not mean you stop praying. It means prayer changes its nature. It ceases to be dialogue and becomes awareness. It ceases to be petition and becomes communion. You no longer say, God, help me. You say nothing, and yet help is present. You no longer say, God, show me the way. You stand still, and the way unfolds. This is not passivity. It is obedience of the highest order. It is obedience to the command, be still. When the old God collapses, there is a brief sense of emptiness, and that emptiness frightens the mind. But the soul recognizes it instantly. The soul knows this is space for God, and in that space, prayer becomes effortless. You are no longer praying to God, you are praying from God. You are no longer trying to reach heaven. Heaven is revealing itself within you. The kingdom of God is within you, not after you ask, not after you understand, not after you fix yourself, within you now. So if you are in that stage where the old prayers no longer satisfy, do not be afraid. Do not run back to noise. Do not manufacture comfort. Stay with the silence. Stay with the unknowing. Because what feels like loss is actually gain. What feels like darkness is actually depth. What feels like the absence of God is the disappearance of illusion. And when that illusion is gone, prayer becomes what it was always meant to be, a resting in God, without words, without effort, without fear. Now we come upon a belief so deeply embedded in human consciousness that it is rarely questioned. And yet, until it is uncovered and relinquished, prayer will always remain an effort instead of a revelation. That belief is this: that something in God's universe is broken and must be fixed. From childhood, we are taught by religion, by medicine, by society itself that discord is personal, that suffering is individual, and that it must be repaired by some power acting upon it. And so prayer becomes the act of asking God to enter a situation and correct it, as if God had somehow been absent when the difficulty arose. But let us look at this very quietly and very honestly. Can that which is infinite be absent from any point? Can God step out of God's own creation and then be summoned back by human prayer? Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If God's presence is inescapable, then prayer cannot be the act of bringing God somewhere. Prayer must be the act of awakening to where God already is. Now, the belief that God must fix what is broken rests on another belief that appearances are reality. We look at the body and call it diseased. We look at circumstances and call them unjust. We look at the world and call it chaotic, and then we ask God to correct what we are seeing. But the Master never taught us to worship appearances. He taught us to see through them, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Righteous judgment is not condemnation. It is discernment. It is the ability to recognize that what appears is not what is. Now, this does not mean that appearances are ignored. It means they are not given authority. It means they are not given power. It means they are not given the dignity of being treated as causes. Disease is not a cause. It is an effect. Lack is not a cause. It is an effect. Fear is not a cause. It is an effect. And prayer that tries to change effects will always struggle, because effects have no life of their own. They are shadows cast by belief. Most of the discords that come to us, yes, most of them are not personal at all. They are the result of universal beliefs accepted unconsciously. Beliefs about bodies, about age, about danger, about scarcity, about punishment, about heredity. These beliefs move through human consciousness like currents, and individuals are caught in them without knowing why. Now, here is the important point. A universal belief is not a law. It is not a power. It has no intelligence. It has no divine authorization. There was once a universal belief that the earth was flat. That belief did not make the earth flat. It only limited the experience of those who accepted it. In the same way, a universal belief in disease does not create disease as a reality. It only creates the appearance of disease in the consciousness that accepts it. So when someone comes to us and says, "Pray for me I am ill, or pray for me, I am afraid, or pray for me, my life is broken. The first thing we must know, not say but know, is this. This has nothing to do with them personally. This is not their sin. This is not their failure. This is not their lack of faith. This is a belief moving through human consciousness. And belief, no matter how widespread, is never power. One with God is a majority. Now, notice what happens when this is understood. Prayer changes immediately. You are no longer pleading for intervention. You are no longer trying to persuade God to act. You are no longer attempting to fix a situation. You are standing still in the recognition that God is already governing God's universe and that governance has never been interrupted. The Lord reigneth. Let the earth rejoice. Rejoice not because appearances are pleasant, but because appearances are not final. When you pray from this standpoint, you do not say, God, remove this condition. You say nothing. You simply rest in the awareness that whatever this appearance claims to be, it is not power, it is not law, it is not presence. And because you do not react to it, it begins to dissolve. Not because you attacked it, but because you withdrew belief from it. This is why reaction is the measure of faith. The moment you react with fear, you have granted power to the appearance. The moment you react with anger, you have acknowledged it as real. The moment you react with urgency, you have confessed that God is late. But when you do not react, when you remain still, poised, inwardly at peace, you are silently affirming the truth without words. God is governing here. Fear not, it is I. Those words were spoken in the midst of a storm, not after it ended, in the midst of it. And the storm did not need to be argued with. It did not need to be fixed. It needed to be recognized for what it was, an appearance without power. So we are learning something very radical here. We are learning that prayer is not the act of fixing broken things, but the act of seeing that nothing in God's universe has ever been broken. This does not make us indifferent. It makes us free. It frees us from the burden of responsibility that was never ours to carry. And now, having seen this, we are ready for the next step. For even when we understand universal belief, even when we refuse to react to appearances, there remains something deeper still, a practice, a way of entering prayer without asking, without thinking, without effort. And that brings us to the heart of this teaching. Now we come to the point where teaching must yield to experience. Up to now, we have been clearing away misconceptions about asking, about effort, about fixing, about reaction. But prayer is not finally understood through explanation. It is understood through contact. And contact is never made through doing. It is made through yielding. So let us speak now, not of theory, but of practice, not of method, but of attitude. For the practice of prayer, without asking, is not something you perform, it is something you permit. The first step is this: begin with nothing. Do not begin with a problem. Do not begin with a desire. Do not begin with a question. If you bring a problem into prayer, you will spend your time trying to solve it. If you bring a desire into prayer, you will spend your time trying to fulfill it. But if you bring nothing, God brings everything. Take no thought, saying, "What shall we eat?" or "What shall we drink?" or "Wherewithal shall we be clothed?" That is not advice for laziness. It is instruction for prayer. It is telling us that the moment thought begins to plan, prayer has ended. So you sit down not to meditate on God, not to think about truth, not to repeat words, but simply to be available. You sit as one who has nothing to say and nothing to prove. You sit as one who acknowledges inwardly, I do not know. That confession, I do not know, is the most powerful prayer you will ever utter, because it silences the mind. And when the mind is silent, the soul becomes audible. Now, when you sit in this way, the mind will attempt to intrude, thoughts will arise, memories will appear, questions will present themselves. Do not fight them. Do not suppress them. Do not follow them. Let them pass as clouds pass across the sky. They are not obstacles. They are simply leftover motion. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Notice again, not his sins, his thoughts. As you remain still, something very subtle begins to happen. The urgency to ask fades. The impulse to fix dissolves. The need to understand relaxes. And in that quieting, there comes a sense, not dramatic, not sensational, of being held. You may feel it as peace. You may feel it as warmth. You may feel it as nothing at all. Do not measure it. Do not label it. Do not seek to repeat it. The moment you try to capture it, you lose it. God cannot be possessed. God can only be received. In thy patience, possess ye your souls. Patience here does not mean waiting for something to happen. It means abiding without movement, remaining without expectation, trusting without evidence. Now let me say this very clearly, because it must be understood. This practice is not about getting answers. It is about surrendering the need for answers. And when the need for answers dissolves, the right answer reveals itself, often without words. Sometimes guidance comes later in the form of an inner conviction. Sometimes it comes as clarity the next day. Sometimes it comes as a change in circumstance without your knowing how it happened. And sometimes it comes simply as peace in the midst of unchanged appearances. But whatever form it takes, it does not come because you asked for it. It comes because you made room for God to be God. The preparation of the heart in man and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Your only responsibility is preparation, making space. The answer is never your responsibility. Now, there will be times, yes, there will be times when nothing seems to happen at all. And in those moments, the temptation is to say, this is not working. But prayer is not a transaction. It is a relationship, and relationships are not measured by immediate results. Do not judge your prayer by what you see. Do not judge it by how you feel. Do not judge it by how quickly conditions change. The seed works in darkness. The child grows in silence. And the deepest transformations in consciousness take place below the surface of awareness. Let God have his perfect work. That is the highest prayer. Not do something for me, but have thy way. And thy way is not forced, it is allowed. So the practice, in its simplicity, is this. Sit quietly, release thought, do not ask, do not deny, do not affirm, do not expect. Let there be a moment, perhaps only a moment, of complete inner stillness. And if that moment comes, even for a second, prayer has been fulfilled. And now, having touched this practice, we are ready to understand something else, something that will deepen it further. For prayer without asking also requires prayer without seeking outcomes, prayer without preference, prayer without attachment to results. And that leads us to the next unfolding. Now, at this point, it may be helpful to see how these principles unfold in actual experience, not as proof, not as demonstration, but as illustration. For truth does not need to be proven, but sometimes the human mind needs to be reassured long enough to step aside. Over the years, many have come to me seeking help. They came with diseases, with broken relationships, with fear, with despair, and almost without exception, they came asking for something to be done. They wanted words. They wanted treatment. They wanted reassurance. They wanted a promise that things would change. And yet, again and again, the deepest healings came when nothing was done, when words ceased, when effort collapsed, when silence took over. I recall one case in particular where the condition had resisted everything. Prayer had been offered, truth had been declared, reason had been exhausted, and still nothing appeared to change. At that point, I knew inwardly that no further mental work would be of any value. The mind had reached its limit. So I said nothing more. I turned inward, not to think, not to affirm, not to deny, but simply to be still. And in that stillness there came no message, no vision, no words, only a deep, unmistakable sense of peace, not excitement, not emotion. Peace. When I rose from that silence, I knew the work was finished, not because something had happened outwardly, but because something had ceased inwardly. Fear was gone, effort was gone, concern was gone, and when concern is gone, the law of harmony is free to operate. That afternoon, word came that the condition had reversed, not gradually, suddenly, and the person involved could not explain it, nor could I. But explanation was unnecessary. God had done what only God can do. This kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. Notice again, not by understanding, not by speaking, not by knowing truths, but by prayer and fasting. And fasting, as we have seen, is fasting from the human will, fasting from mental effort, fasting from the desire to control outcomes. There was another instance where a family was consumed by fear. Fear for a loved one, fear of loss, fear of the unknown, and fear, when multiplied, becomes a presence in itself. Words only fed it, reason only strengthened it. So instead of addressing the condition, we entered silence together. No words, no guidance, no reassurance, just quiet, just waiting. And in that waiting, something shifted, not in the condition at first, but in consciousness. Fear lost its grip. It had nothing to attach to. And when fear dissolved, the appearance it was sustaining had no support. Perfect love casteth out fear, not spoken love, not declared love, realized love. And love is never noisy. Now, I want you to see something very important here. In none of these cases was there an attempt to help a person. That may sound strange, but the moment you try to help, you assume that something is wrong. And the moment you assume something is wrong, you have accepted the appearance as reality. Instead, the practice was always the same. Withdraw belief from the appearance, withdraw attention from the condition, withdraw effort from the mind, and rest in God. I am the Lord, and there is none else. If that is true, then where is disease? Where is lack? Where is danger? They can only exist as beliefs entertained by the human mind. And the moment the mind rests, those beliefs dissolve. Now, sometimes the mind protests and says, but what if nothing happens? And the answer is, if nothing happens outwardly, something has happened inwardly. And inward change is always the first step. Do not judge your prayer by the clock. Do not judge it by symptoms. Do not judge it by appearances. Judge it by one thing only. Has fear diminished? Has urgency dissolved? Has effort ceased? If so, prayer has been answered, whether or not the outer picture has caught up yet. Let patience have her perfect work. Many healings are delayed not because God is slow, but because we resume effort too quickly. We return to watching, to measuring, to worrying, and in doing so, we reassert belief in appearances. Silence does not hurry. Silence does not argue. Silence does not insist. Silence trusts. And that trust, unspoken, unformed, unclaimed, is the most powerful force in spiritual work. So these experiences are not meant to impress you. They are meant to free you from the burden of responsibility, from the pressure of performance, from the belief that you must do something to deserve God's action. You do not bring about healing. You do not bring about harmony. You do not bring about peace. You witness what is already established when you stop interfering. And now, having seen how silence works in practice, we are ready to go still deeper. For prayer without asking also requires freedom from preference, freedom from wanting one outcome over another. That is perhaps the most difficult step of all. Now we come to a point that tests the sincerity of our prayer more than any other. It is one thing to refrain from asking. It is another thing altogether to refrain from wanting a particular outcome. And yet, until this is understood, prayer will always be mixed with personal will. You see, most prayer fails, not because it is weak, not because it is wrong, but because it is conditional. It says, I will trust God if this turns out the way I hope. But trust that depends on outcome is not trust. It is bargaining. The human mind always has preferences. It prefers health to illness, harmony to discord, abundance to lack, life to death. And from the human standpoint, this seems natural, even right. But prayer is not a human activity. Prayer is a spiritual surrender. And spirit does not negotiate, not my will, but thine be done. Those words were not spoken lightly. They were spoken at the moment when human desire was laid completely on the altar. And until we reach that point, we are still praying with one hand while holding on with the other. Now, let us be very clear. This does not mean that we become indifferent or careless. It does not mean we resign ourselves to suffering. It means we trust God more than we trust appearances. It means we acknowledge that God's wisdom is greater than our personal sense of what constitutes good. There are times when the human mind says, this must change or I cannot be at peace. And prayer says, be at peace and let God determine the change. The middle path is neither hope nor fear. It is not optimism and it is not pessimism. It is neutrality. And neutrality is not coldness. It is freedom. When you no longer love an appearance or hate an appearance, you have removed the emotional charge that gives it power. Love and hate are both attachments. Fear and desire are both forms of belief. And belief sustains appearances. But when you stand in the middle, neither pulling nor pushing, you are standing in spiritual authority. He that believeth shall not make haste. Haste is always a sign of attachment. Urgency is always a confession of fear. The soul that trusts does not hurry God. It does not supervise outcomes. It does not demand proof. Now, there will be moments when this feels difficult. The human heart says, but surely God wants this for me. And perhaps God does. But prayer is not about guessing what God wants. Prayer is about letting go of the need to decide. I have seen many cases where the human desire was sincere, and yet the outcome that brought peace was not the one the mind had chosen. Relationships ended and harmony followed. Plans collapsed and freedom appeared. Doors closed and greater doors open. What God hath not joined together, let not man put asunder. We often reverse that and try to join together what God has not joined. We try to hold in place what has completed its purpose. And then we ask God to bless our attachment. Prayer does not bless attachment. Prayer dissolves it. The middle path says, whether this stays or goes, God remains. Whether the body improves or worsens, God remains. Whether the situation resolves or delays, God remains. And when God remains central, appearances lose their tyranny. Now, something very important happens when you reach this point. The mind grows quiet, not because it has answers, but because it has surrendered the need for them. And in that quietness, guidance often appears naturally, effortlessly, without pressure. You may find yourself doing something without knowing why. You may find yourself speaking words you did not plan. You may find yourself at peace in circumstances that once terrified you. This is not resignation. This is alignment. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. Notice again, commit, not manage. Trust, not supervise. So prayer without preference does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop controlling. It means you rest in the confidence that God's will is not against you, even when it contradicts your expectations. And when you can stand in that middle path without leaning toward hope or fear, you have entered a prayer that cannot fail because it is no longer yours. And now, having reached this place of neutrality, of surrender, of inner stillness, something else becomes clear. Prayer is no longer something you do at certain times. It becomes a state of being, a way of living, a consciousness that walks through the world without reaction. And that brings us to the final unfoldment of this message. Now we come to the point where prayer is no longer something you practice, but something you are. Up to now, we have spoken of prayer as silence, as surrender, as non-reaction, as freedom from preference. But all of these are only ways of describing a deeper transformation that takes place when the human sense of self steps aside. At this stage, you are no longer the one praying. Prayer is happening through you. This is the great secret that cannot be taught, only lived. For as long as you believe yourself to be the doer, you will feel burdened by responsibility. You will feel that it is up to you to pray rightly, to trust sufficiently, to remain still long enough. But when the transformation occurs, that burden lifts, because you see that you were never meant to be the doer at all. I can of mine own self do nothing. Those words were not spoken as a confession of weakness. They were spoken as a statement of spiritual fact. When the sense of a separate doer dissolves, God does not withdraw, God takes over. Now, do not misunderstand this. This does not mean that you become passive or inactive. On the contrary, life often becomes more active, more purposeful, more effective. But the activity is no longer driven by personal will. It flows naturally, spontaneously, without strain. You find yourself speaking when words are needed, and remaining silent when silence is required. You find yourself moving without planning, resting without guilt, acting without anxiety. There is a sense that life is living itself through you. It is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. At this point, prayer ceases to be an event. It is no longer confined to morning or evening, to quiet rooms or special postures. Prayer becomes a continuous awareness of God's presence. Whether you are walking, working, resting, or facing difficulty, there is an inner stillness that does not leave you. You may still encounter challenges. Appearances will still arise, but they no longer disturb the depths of consciousness. They touch the surface, but they do not penetrate. The center remains at rest. Thou shalt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, stayed not strained, stayed not forced. Now, when you live in this way, something very beautiful happens. Others feel it. You may not speak of God, but God is felt. You may not offer advice, but clarity arises. You may not attempt to heal, but healing takes place. This is what it means to be an instrument, not a channel that tries to direct power, but a transparency through which power flows unobstructed. The moment you think, I am doing this, the flow slows. The moment you say, God is doing this, the flow resumes. And eventually, even that thought falls away, and there is only the doing. I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. This is not poetry. It is not metaphor. It is the literal description of a consciousness in which the personal sense of self has been surrendered to the divine presence. Now, this does not happen overnight. It unfolds, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly. There may be moments when the old sense of effort returns. There may be times when fear tries to reassert itself. Do not fight it. Simply return again and again to stillness. Every return to stillness deepens the transformation. Every refusal to react strengthens trust. Every moment of silence widens the channel, and eventually, prayer, as you once knew it, fades into the background. You no longer ask God for help. You no longer seek reassurance. You no longer measure progress. You live from a quiet confidence that does not announce itself. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. Hold your peace, not because you are inactive, but because you know where the action truly is. So this is the fruit of prayer, without asking. Not miracles as events, but harmony as a state of being. Not answers as information, but guidance as movement. Not peace as a feeling, but peace as identity. And from this place, life unfolds naturally, gracefully, without struggle. You are no longer trying to reach God. You are no longer trying to live spiritually. You are simply allowing what is true to be true. And that is the highest prayer. And now we come to the place where words must gently withdraw and allow silence to reclaim its rightful position. For everything that has been said up to this point has not been spoken to give you something to remember, but to lead you to something you can return to. The silence. You see, the silence we have spoken of is not an experience you have once and then move beyond. It is not a peak you reach and then descend from. It is a living presence to which you return again and again until returning becomes unnecessary because you never really leave it. Prayer, in its highest sense, is not something you do daily. It is something you live from. It is a way of meeting life without resistance, without fear, without the constant need to understand or control. When you awaken in the morning, you do not need to say many words. You do not need to plan a prayer. You do not need to set an intention. A single inward recognition is enough. God is. And when the day brings its challenges as it will, you do not need to rush inward with requests. You do not need to ask God to intervene. You simply pause, even if only for a moment, and let the mind be still. In that stillness, the presence that has never left you will be felt again. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. Notice that the burden is cast, not carried, not analyzed, not improved, and casting does not require explanation. It requires release. Now, I want to say something that may seem paradoxical. There will be days when you forget all of this. There will be moments when fear returns, when reaction rises, when the old habits of thought reassert themselves. Do not judge those moments. Do not condemn yourself. Do not try to correct them. Simply return. Return to stillness. Return to silence. Return to the recognition that God is present before thought, beneath feeling, beyond effort. Every return deepens the habit of non-reaction. Every return loosens the grip of fear. Every return strengthens the awareness that prayer is not something you perform, but something you allow. The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. Those arms do not appear when you ask for them. They are already there when you stop struggling. So let this be your practice, not as discipline, but as devotion, not as duty, but as love. When life presses in, do not press back. When appearances shout, do not argue. When uncertainty arises, do not demand answers. Be still. That is not retreat. That is spiritual authority. And remember this, you do not need to protect this silence. The silence protects you. You do not need to defend this awareness. This awareness dissolves what needs no defense. In time, and time here is not measured in days or weeks, you will notice something has changed. You are less disturbed by events, less hurried by outcomes, less reactive to appearances, and more at home in yourself. That is not because life has become easier. It is because you are no longer meeting life alone. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. That promise was never conditional. It did not depend on right prayer, right belief, or right behavior. It depended only on recognition. So, as we close, let us not close with words. Let us close with a simple inward acknowledgement, no effort, no intention, no request, just this: thank you. Not for something done, not for something received, but for what eternally is. And now let us be still.